Welcome to the church library. Draw up a chair and join us as we sort through these stacks of old books. I'm Marissa Burt.
And I'm Kelsey McGinnis. And here in the church library, we host conversations about popular Christian books. This season, we are dusting off Christian parenting resources.
Our book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting, How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families, examines many of these books, the obscure, the bestsellers, the ones that still pop up in church parenting classes.
Let's see what's on the bookshelves today. Hello, Marissa.
Hello, Kelsey. It's so good to see you.
Good to see you, too. I am talking to you from Atlanta this week. It's unusual.
Yeah. So at a conference, right?
Yes, I'm at a conference this week. So I'm looking out a hotel window instead of like in my living room somewhere. But it is so good to see you.
Yes, but Christian parenting conversation will follow you even there.
Yes, of course. And
yes.
Fewer chances of being interrupted here because I'm not recording and also kind of watching out of the corner of my eye for a kid to come knocking. So
Fair. Well, I'm in my usual home office. Tucked away in here, but hopefully we won't be interrupted. Well, what do we have in the church library today?
Well, is this our most requested resource that we're talking about? We are talking this week about Gary and Anne-Marie Ezzo's Babywise.
Between Babywise and Growing Kids God's Way, we've gotten a lot of requests to cover those. So here we are.
Here we are.
Do it.
We're going to talk about these. This is probably going to be a two-parter.
It is. It's
probably our first two-part conversation.
Yes. Oh, and before we dive in, though, we did want to mention we have gotten some messages through Buzzsprout from you all that we can't respond to in print. So we'd like to do that on an episode. And we also would like to do a Q&A episode, maybe to end the season or maybe midway through. We're not exactly sure, but wanted to let you know if you have questions that you'd like us to answer in a podcast episode, send them our way, either through the fan mail in the notes for Buzzsprout, our podcast host provider, or send us an email.
Yeah, or you can message them to us on social media
That's
too.
True. I'll keep
a running list somewhere. But yes, we've loved getting messages. Thank you for those of you who have sent us some. Mm-hmm. A lot of you have some really interesting insight and expertise also just from your own experiences with this. So we love hearing from you. Thank you so much. And we would love to know what questions you have. And I don't know if we get enough questions, maybe we'll do one partway through the season and one at the end.
Yeah, that could be fun too. Yeah.
We'll see. But anyway, this is a much requested, much asked for resource, Babywise, Growing Kids God's Way by Gary and Anne-Marie Ezzo. And I am always, when we started researching for this book, and I was looking through news archives, just sort of looking through old periodicals just to see, this was the thing that popped up.
Yeah.
Almost more than anything else. Sort of if Christian parenting was in the news sometime in the 80s or 90s, it was this.
Yeah.
Or I should say 90s, probably not 80s. But yeah, so this has made news. This might be the kind of thing that if you have no other run-in with Christian parenting, the words Babywise might bring up something, might ping something for you, especially if you were a parent then.
I mean, for lack of a better word, drama around it. There's a lot of, we'll get into it because we'll need to talk about them and the history and kind of the timeline and what happened. And certainly if you were parenting in the 90s and early aughts, people had strong feelings about the Ezzos one way or the other, and Growing Kids God's Way and Babywise in Christian circles. So
yes.
Yeah, this is an interesting one because it kind of, I don't want to say it was flash in the pan, but it really was not long lasting in a sense. So it was very intense for kind of a micro generation.
Right.
Of evangelicals, I think. So
yes. And we'll talk about why. There are some very clear reasons why. But before we do that, who are Gary and Anne-Marie Ezzo? Paint us a picture of these people.
Yeah. So where to begin? Once upon a time, Gary Ezzo was a pastor, and he pastored a church out on the East Coast and was asked to leave by his, I think the eldership or whoever it might have been at that church. They moved out to California as a family. They had several kids at this time. Gary received a master's degree in pastoral studies through a program available to people without a bachelor's degree. So his primary education was in like seminary pastoral ministry. Anne-Marie was a nurse. And they describe how there's a little bit of a conflicting stories. They describe it a couple of different ways in different resources, but basically they say the origin of their parenting resources ministry was couples approaching them for parenting advice, and they kind of sat down with them, and that was so successful that it snowballed. And then there were 12 couples, and then there were 100 couples, and then there were more. And depending on what resource you hear this story in, it either was just them doing this or them plus a group of 4 or 5 other couples. So you'll see why that matters maybe later on. So this became the beginning of what was to become one of the most recognizable parenting empires, because they were at Grace Community Church. That's the full name of it, right?
Yes.
John MacArthur's church in California. Yes. That's where they landed in the early 80s. So 1984 is when they place it, their ministry beginning. Grace Church, even at that time, was a mega church. They had about 3,500 worshipers. By 1990, kind of nearing the peak of the Ezzo's reach, they were at 8,000 members just at the church. And they began doing parenting classes there. They began speaking through the radio ministry of that church, which had national reach. They eventually had their own kind of parenting show on a radio ministry. So they had access to a lot of key evangelical figures who initially endorsed them quite heartily. And the people who were all in on their resources were all in. Their original resource was kind of like a preparing for parenting resource, which we don't come across that a whole lot in Christian parenting. It's like kind of prenatal guide. But then they began producing things for every stage of a parenting journey, originally only for the Christian market. But then they pivoted and they adapted their resources. It's kind of interesting for a completely secular market. So that what they started with, they tweaked to become the On Becoming Babywise, On Becoming Childwise, On Becoming Teenwise, that did very well in the secular market. So they kind of stripped it of the biblical language and similar principles. So it's kind of their origin story, I would say.
Did you read either of these as a new parent?
So as a new parent, no. I came across it twice. Once when I was nannying in college. So this would have been in the late 90s. There was a family I nannied for that was into Babywise. And so I remember that was the first time I had come across this kind of approach to, it was like there was an infant and an 18-month-old that I nannied for. It was the first time I'd come through this really scheduled, and we'll get into a little bit more of what it looked like, but this really scheduled approach to feeding and sleeping in my babysitting years. And then, so I just kind of filed that away because I thought, well, that seems important. Like maybe this would be helpful for me later on if I have kids. And then after my first child was born, so in the early 2000s, the church we were at had started a Growing Kids God's Way Christian education for the parents there. So I never actually attended it, and we moved cross country shortly thereafter. But probably if we had stayed there, I maybe would have. So it was in kind of this was an Anglican parish, so it was in all kinds of denominations in the early 2000s for sure. What about you? I mean, where did that fall in your personal experience?
Well, so just to start off, we'll talk more in detail about this, but we should say right up front, Babywise is sort of known and remembered for exactly this kind of the scheduling, the hyper regimented approach to baby care and child rearing. There are a lot of reasons why it's associated with harsh authoritarian parenting that we will get to. So I was born in 1989.
Okay.
And at the time, my parents were on staff with Campus Crusade for Christ, and we lived in Southern California, very close to John MacArthur's church.
Yes. Okay.
So my parents did not go to that church, but many of their good friends did. It was a really influential church. And they knew at least one couple who were one of these all in on the Babywise train thing. And my mom would later, when I was a new mom, told me these stories of this mom just being so adamant about certain things like feeding schedules and not letting the child dictate your schedule, not letting the child be in charge, not letting the child dictate when they are and aren't fed, all these things, that being really, really important. And later on, I don't think my mom told me this story about this particular friend of hers, but she knew of moms who had like Babywise coaches who basically it was like another older parent who you could call like in the middle of the night when your baby wakes up and cries and you are going to lose your mind saying, I want to go get my baby. They will talk you down and say, don't let your child manipulate you. Don't let your child dictate to you what is going to happen here. So that's my experience with, I didn't read it as a new, no one ever gave it to me. My parents were not into it as new parents or parents ever, but they knew people who were, and they saw it kind of playing out among their young parenting friends. My parents were pretty young. I think my mom was 24 when I was born, so they were young, and they were watching their fellow young parents try to figure this out. And being given this extreme, regimented way of trying to do this that was absolutely combined with a lot of spiritual language about parental authority. So
absolutely, as we'll see, that's the root of it. And I think you really nailed the coaching aspect is a huge part of why it took such root, I think. And we've heard from a number of people who have reached out to say, oh, we were a Growing Kids God's Way family, and my parents were coaches or something like this. And this is kind of what it would happen would be a lot of peer reinforcement, because you could kind of train to be a coach if you wanted, and then they would expand into the community. And as we'll see, when people started raising concerns and objections, then it often split churches, or people would leave because there would be a cluster of people all in on this. So then to call that into question became really divisive. And I mean, it spread all over the place. By the late 90s, they claimed that 70,000 families were attending weekly parenting classes. And
70,000 families?
Families globally.
Wow.
And then they, it's diminished, as with many of these parenting empires, it is diminished here in America. However, it still has global reach. There currently are streaming classes globally that you can still attend for growing. I think it's called now Growing Families International or something. They kind of like rebranded, but So it really did have a pulse on brand loyalty, I think. And you see that even when they go secular with On Becoming Babywise, they trademarked that term. So I think they had some marketing savvy behind this as well that was maybe ahead of their time, where they really built loyalty. And I was thinking about this when I was reading, because I reread Babywise in preparation for this conversation. And I was thinking about how we talk a lot about how vulnerable new parents are, but imagine reading the preparing for parenting when you're pregnant, hearing, as you'll see, their very authoritative pitch that you don't want a baby who's been raised to be me-centered and permissive and self-indulgent. You need to stay in charge no matter what. And going into parenting that way, you're going to be, I think, even more all in than maybe you would be if you were 8 months in, sleep deprived, looking for help. Like if you go in, it's all theoretical from the starting place. And then here you are with the first book, which is the infancy, and then the toddlerhood, and then the next. And you really feel like these are the people who are going to coach me through. I don't know. It seems like kind of like once you're on that train.
Yeah. Okay. So hold on.
Okay.
They start this class. sorry, you might have said this already.
Yeah.
Did the class precede them going to John MacArthur's church, or did they start doing this and then they moved to John MacArthur's church? Do you know
It
what
kind of
order?
sounds like, I mean, it gets a little murky. So this would
Okay.
have been the early 80s. So there's not a ton. And some of it's like articles people have written about them.
Yeah.
So I feel comfortable saying it, but it's a little bit hard to get the timeline of like, when did it actually start? But it sounds to me like, no, he was doing pastoral work. And then that was not going to, he was kind of kicked out from that, and they started attending the church, and then they describe it as this very organic thing, almost like people approached them and they did it, and what do you know, people were just so hungry to hear more. So they describe it as a very organic thing, that it began with the class. They had this self-published manual that they would take, kind of like, it reminds me a little bit of IBLP, honestly. It was like a self-published manual, lots of Q&A. There were video series or tape series or seminars you could go to. And that really launched parents into it. But then it was supported by the coaching, the radio series, and later the secular resources. And you can still get, I do have, when we talk about Growing Kids God's Way, I do have those. They still read very much as manuals. They're thick. There are many chapters. It feels like a manual. And I think I think a lot of people encountered them as secular parents. When they rebranded, they kind of tried to affiliate with medical doctors, but the original resources are all biblically based, and I'm putting that in quotes. The idea being these are biblical principles. And so, chapter 1 is going to open with, we need to talk about Christian marriage because we need to go back to the garden for the biblical basis and the order of the home and a lot of the things that show up in the other resources we talk about. But yeah, the idea was this is God's design for families from the get-go. So in that sense, you can see why it would be appealing for Grace Church people. This is John MacArthur. John MacArthur is pretty big endorser of the nouthetic frame of thought that we've talked about of biblical counseling. So you have thousands of people looking to know God's blueprint and the biblical way to parent. This is an audience ripe for this kind of messaging.
Yeah. Okay. So what is their central pitch? Like, especially thinking like growing kids God's way. Let's start in the Bible focused Growing Kids God's Way, because that seems to be how they really spun this out into an empire. What is their, like, what are the key tenets of this?
Yeah, well, I need to reread Growing Kids God's Way before I can speak intelligently to that in a comprehensive way, but because it's been over a year since I read it. But when I read it, what I'm remembering is it's really an idea that Christianity is about moral behavior, and we really need to raise moral children, obedient children, but there's a strong emphasis on virtue and morality that's a little bit different than some of the total depravity based resources you read. So they kind of envision parenting as a way to teach your children morals, make sure that they kind of get on that path and stay on that path. And the primary way to do that is through parent direction. Everything is parent directed. It's the parental authority piece is a really key piece. But yeah, that's a big piece of it. And when you talk to people who grew up in Growing Kids God's Ways families, they often were remarkably isolated. Again, similar to IBLP. So a big piece of raising moral families was shutting out immoral influences. So many children would then be around Growing Kids God's Way families in their churches. Again, they were often homeschooled. So it really became, there's a reason critics later called it cult-like, because similar to IBLP or other movements like this, there was a kind of isolation that could be going on. The other piece that I think was worth naming that shows up as an important thing is couch time. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, this is it's mom and dad time, right? That's what this is?
Yeah, but it's a very it shows up in a lot of their resources. It shows up in Babywise, and that's why it kind of struck me because Babywise is for infants, but they're telling parents you really need to have 15 minutes a day at the end of the day just together on the couch, which is pretty benign advice. But the key piece about this is your children can't interrupt you and need to be watching you have this uninterrupted time.
Huh.
So the idea is your children see that your marriage is the priority, that you can be totally focused, that they are secondary to the marriage relationship. And in fact, I think it's Gary who says, basically, I'm paraphrasing, when we see that everything is very good in the garden, children aren't there. It's man and woman marriage who are very good. So it's kind of a very weird framing of children as very important. This work is very important, but they're a threat to the goodness of the marriage relationship. It's presented that way. It's odd.
Very odd.
And it's odd in a baby book, right? Like, it's like, are you going to have your baby watch you do this? Or are they just wanting to, I don't know. But it's a key thing. And in Growing Kids God's Way, later editions, they have little sidebars with quotes from older children as kind of like testimonials. And a lot of them mention couch time, which is fascinating to me, a lot of the kids. So I really do think this was a staple piece of it.
Interesting. So this is in the 80s now, but it does strike me as like, no, the emergence of no-fault divorce in California, so Reagan did that when he was governor of California. Okay. That would have been not too long before. There's a lot of panic about divorce. Yeah. And I think that comes through in stuff like that in these resources. So like you need, and like this is one of those like cases where good thing for the wrong reasons or good things with the wrong method, right? Like we're not saying
things with,
right. Like, yes, your marriage is important, like, I mean, we're not giving advice here, but it's like, on the surface, it's like, that's a fine thing. But there is this like dominion kind of piece of it. And also is this from their resources? So I've heard from multiple people who grew up in evangelical homes that like at one point or another, their parents like made it a point to like sit them down and say, I love your mom more than you. I love your dad more than you. It's important to me that you know that. Like,
I wouldn't be surprised if it came. I mean, it's very much that vibe you're getting this, and whether it's fear-based or they present it in Babywise, because of course that's stripped from the Christian language. They can't say God's order is that a strong marriage, but they say your baby will feel the most secure if your marriage is strong. So they kind of present it that way, like that will be the best. So again, like you mentioned, some of this is neutral or benign or fine or common advice, but there's an edge to it that is notable when you see it, and troubling, honestly, when you see it, especially when you see how authoritative the advice is, for sure. So yeah, that's an interesting piece of it. Babywise itself, I don't know. Do you want to talk more about what the controversy, or should we talk about the content of Babywise? Where should we go next?
That's what I'm trying to decide. I'm wondering if, I think in our little outline that you have here, we have the controversy first. I'm wondering if it might be helpful to people to hear about the content first.
I think so.
Because the content really helps explain why there's so much controversy about Babywise. Because some of it is truly wild, and a lot of it is really tragic, like real tragedy here downstream of some of these teachings. So let's talk about Babywise. So Babywise is the secularized version of this Growing Kids God's Way, which is so interesting to me because like in some ways they're trying to do a dare to discipline here. Like a lot, we've talked before about how a lot of Dobson's 1970 dare to discipline is not particularly religious. He's trying to give this kind of authoritarian oriented parenting advice to just anxious parents and trying to reinstill values of, discipline, good behavior, obedience, those kinds of things.
Right.
So is that what this is?
I wonder. I wish I could be on a fly on the wall on the conversation that happened about let's reach secular audiences, because I'm envisioning the evangelical impulse that would be, we have the truth about godly parenting that will help families, like kind of the missional impulse. So how can we get this truth? This is God's blueprint to all families. That's maybe the benefit of the doubt there would be just that they're like, we want to help. I'm not sure how it exactly happened, how it went down, obviously. But when they pivot, it's an interesting foil to Dare to Discipline. They don't turn to psychology or social sciences. They try and present with a medical authority. So from pediatricians and physicians. So Babywise has a co-author. We'll talk about him later, who is a medical doctor who became a pediatrician. Bucknam, I think is his last name. I don't have it in front of me. He was 1 year out of medical school. And in his preface, he talks about how, I don't think it was his medical training that led him to this book. He talks about how when he was a new parent, he read the Ezzo's parenting stuff and liked it, was drawn to it. So I wonder if he was at Grace or if he was a parent who kind of liked what he saw. And you'll see that throughout Babywise and Growing Kids God's Way. They present they invite parents to compare their teaching to other popular teaching, which is a little bit of a departure from some of these resources, right? That are saying we've got the only way. And they say compare based on the fruit of it, like evaluate what you see, how it's working out. And so in Babywise, that comes across, of course, as, you look around, you'll see rested, well-rested parents, content babies, ordered household where the mother and father have a great marriage based on these principles. And then they often will do a false dichotomy. Well, they compare that to a straw man of exhausted parents, me-centered children, chaotic house, so there's a pseudo curiosity about these resources of like, see, these principles just will really work. So we have no problem with you evaluating the fruit because this is going to be really good for your family.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I went and looked at when William Sears wrote his books.
Yes, it's around this time.
It is around this time. So William Sears associated with attachment parenting, which some of Babywise to me strikes me a little bit as a reaction against some of attachment parenting because of the very high demand of kind of being with your baby, doing nighttime feedings, like a lot of that can for some parents become this form of just really high exhaustion parenting. But I looked, his book, the baby book, that probably the one that is like the big one that he did was 1993. Yeah. But his first book was called Nighttime Parenting, and it was published in 1985. And I just don't know enough about what was kind of in the water parenting, like in California, leading up to Growing Kids God's Way and Babywise. But I imagine if attachment parenting ideas were starting to catch on.
Oh, yeah. They do not like attachment parenting.
Right.
They hate it. It's very clear in Babywise. That is the villain. That is the villain throughout this book. Yeah. 100% reactionary.
So and for those who aren't super familiar with attachment parenting, I mean, attachment parenting doesn't have the stable definition either, but it's very much pro baby wearing. So like the popularity of slings and wearables to carry a baby with you, co-sleeping.
Kind of like constant available child-led feeding. So nursing on demand, child-led weaning. So really like the child's giving the cues. The rhetoric, it was interesting reading this after we did our conversation on gentle parenting because it's very similar rhetoric. It is this age-old, too permissive. It's the concern is too permissive or the concern is too rigid, right? There's like this tug of war back and forth of people in different camps. And so, yeah.
Gosh. So that makes sense to me, that this would be in some ways, unlike James Dobson, who I think is kind of like reacting to like the political climate.
Yes.
It really seems like the Ezzos are reacting to baby care advice.
Yes.
And
parenting for the lifespan. I think it's child-centered, because there's a one point, I almost wrote the quote where they kind of say, if you're going to start out responding to the child's needs, like that's the measure of parenting, to envision that your job as a parent is to serve the baby's needs, what are you going to do when they're a child, a tween, or a teen? So for them, that's a worst case scenario. Kind of like, if you start out child-centered, there's no off-ramp here, and you're never going to get your authority back, kind of. And they even title their program PDF, Parent-Directed Feeding, right? Like that's their terminology. So it really is concern. And I think you're right. I think maybe they were looking around at the broader culture, but you really have the sense that they were looking around at all these parents who were choosing wrong, who were choosing the wrong kind of parenting that would be too permissive. So they really needed to pull that back and get people back on the right track.
Okay. Yeah. So tell me more about parent-directed feeding and how they talk about it. Tell me more about this.
So they introduce it almost as if it's a middle of the road path, is how they present it. So they kind of set up that here are your options as a parent. You're a new parent reading this book. Your option is scheduled feeding by the clock every 4 hours. And they kind of point back to like the 1950s for that. Or attachment parenting, which is child-led, feed on demand. And they kind of say neither, those both have too many cons. We're suggesting in the middle, where you are learning your baby's cues and only feeding at that point. But you have a loose schedule that really, a lot of what they say is not particularly radical, right? They sort of say you should try and go for a cycle of feed, wake, sleep. And that's what you should aim for your baby. And you should watch their hunger cues for feed, keep them awake, and then sleep, which is pretty standard these days if you go to find out. So they present that as the option, but where it gets weird is what they do with that. Like it's not presented loosely. It's kind of the worst of both worlds, honestly. They present it as the middle of the road, but because they have threaded in here the idea that your baby might be trying to manipulate you or trying to displace your authority, they have this idea that there are times when you really can't trust your baby's cues. They might be trying to manipulate you. So I think, as we'll see later on, this came under so much fire for failure to thrive and things like this in infants, because they took away parental, the like safeguard for watching cues, which would be like, if your baby hasn't eaten every 4 hours, you really should at least have every 4 hours type thing. So they kind of tried to go for the middle of the road, maybe. But this other messaging that's like at one point they talk about the different types of cries babies can have, and they encourage parents to try and decode their baby's cries, right? Good advice that you'd probably find in most parenting books. But they parse out the cries as either appropriate cries or, quote, training cries. So cries that maybe a baby would need to be trained out of. So they do some weird things like this that take the advice, which feels pretty like, okay, that's an option, to make it quite dangerous advice, especially for new parents who are caught up in this idea that if I don't follow this to the letter or in the right way, I'm going to be raising maybe an immoral, me-centered child down the road.
Huh.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that this is also an interesting way of storytelling throughout the book. They say they're going to fictionally talk about two different families. So they have this dichotomy going on. One is the family of Chelsea. her family is going to follow the Babywise plan. And the other is the family of Marissa, which made me laugh because it's such a 90s name. The other is the family of Marissa, who they are not going to follow the Babywise plan. So you have these fictionalized stories in every chapter of how happy and adjusted and wonderful things are going in Chelsea's family, how unhappy and exhausted and spoiling their child everyone in Marissa's family is. And this is going throughout too. So it's a really interesting read because it doesn't have, I'll be curious to talk about Growing Kids God's Way, which has the religious messaging. Babywise doesn't have the religious messaging, so it doesn't have that ominous kind of feel of, wow, they're really saying this is God's authoritative way.
Right.
But they're coming in with that authoritarian, this is the best way to parent in a bunch of other angles, like through powerful storytelling, through this kind of like unspoken fear that if you don't do this, your child's going to not be thoughtful of others, not be intelligent. They even talk about on one page, they quote a study, and they say, oh, I'm going to find the exact quote. Hold on. Tell me your thoughts on the baby-led weedings while I find this quote. What does that stir up in you to hear it?
I'm kind of hung up on the appropriate versus the training cries.
It's weird, right?
It's a strange kind of.
It's very strange. And then they give examples of them. So the training cries would be before feeding or before sleep. Like those are ones that are not okay.
You're supposed to train your infant out of crying before sleep or feeding?
Yes, because theoretically they'll be on this schedule that you've worked out. So if they're crying before feeding, they might be crying for comfort and not feeding, or crying for something else. But they don't say to comfort them necessarily. They're just, you are going to train them such that they will stop crying for those things. But permissible cries would be if they wake up in the middle of a sleep with a sharp cry or after feeding for digestion. And so they basically say, especially if you didn't start this program from week 1, we need to talk about that. Week 1, postpartum. This is a quote, you are moving from high comfort style of sleep manipulation to basic training. So they really do kind of present an infant crying off schedule as manipulative. And yeah, that's the other huge problem. They start it at week 2 postpartum. They basically say week 1 postpartum, you can feed on demand. Week 2, you're starting not just the like feed, wake, sleep. No. Yes, feed, wake, sleep cycle, but you are trying to get them on this Babywise schedule from that week.
Wow.
Which is
okay.
Wild. Yeah.
That's unusual.
Yeah.
And
not recommended.
No, and not recommended. So walk me through, because I know how this story ends.
Yes.
I know what the fallout of this is.
Yes.
Like you said, some of what they have said so far, you could find forms of it in very mainstream.
Absolutely.
You know, like the feed, wake time, go to sleep is a common thing. There are lots of like parenting, baby care influencers who say the same thing, who like will warn parents about feeding to sleep, for example, not wanting to get in the habit of doing that. Whereas attachment people would say, feed your baby to sleep. This is so easy.
Right.
There's a lot of disagreement about these things.
Yes.
But some of what we've talked about gives little hints that like this could quickly become more and more extreme. I mean, the first big hint to me is when they say to start doing it at a week old, and when they start saying that the cry of a baby off schedule is manipulative. So like, walk me through how this gets extrapolated out into the more extreme things that we see them get in trouble for later.
Well, I mean, some of it's us trying to fill in blanks, right? unless we could speak with someone who implemented this directly. But I tend to think what you have is vulnerable people who have an infant and who've maybe read this leading up to pregnancy, to welcoming the child home while they're pregnant, or in the early season postpartum. And so they're like, great, these people speak with such confidence. They open the book with a promise that's basically like, it's not luck to have these outcomes of like a baby who sleeps. It's good parenting.
It's good
they,
parenting.
They say that. So they really lay this out of like, you just need to apply this and you can have these results. So then I think if you have particularly first-time parents who don't know what they're looking for in an infant, they're maybe going by the book. And it says a medical doctor's signing off on this, right? And there's a lot of endorsements in the original edition from doctors. Now, I don't know what their credentials are or what, but there's probably like a dozen doctors. That's their endorsement pages, doctors and parents saying how great this is. So I think I can see a scenario where, yes, if you are a parent, sleep exhausted, frustrated, they're not saying something that would necessarily ping up your flags. Right? They're not even saying sinful or something. They're sort of saying it's your job as the parent to toughen up, take authority. That's for your child's well-being. It's a little bit, they don't use the term tough love, right? But they kind of are like, yeah, no one likes hearing a baby cry. You won't like hearing your baby cry. It'll be hard, but this is for the best. That's kind of their messaging. So, and they do give some guidelines, like I think they sort of say, from 2 to 8 weeks, you probably won't, they may not sleep through the night fully. But they kind of say by 8 weeks, your baby will be sleeping through the night fully.
They like outright promise. Like, if you do this right, you will get a baby sleeping through the night by 8 weeks.
They do say that the one caveat they say is for a breastfed baby before 8 weeks, you should wake them after 5 hours. So I want to throw them that bone because they do have that tiny qualification, but then they include things that they present as research. And these are studies of parents who've used PDF. So my guess is they've just rounded up however many people at Grace maybe, or other people they know who used this, and they survey them. So for instance, they present this as evidence. They say there were 520 babies who used PDF. 80% of them were sleeping through their night on their own by 8 weeks, and 20% got there through 3 to 5 days of cried out method. So that's 100%. They're sort of saying you will get there. And their version of cried out method is the baby cries, and it's a training cry. So the parent, if they can, should stay out of the room. If they can't, they can go in, pat the baby on the back, and leave. And they're kind of like, either the baby will self-soothe or continue to cry. And they never give any advice as to a cutoff for that, right? Okay. They never say, and if it's been 20 minutes, stop, or something. At least in this edition of the book that I read, that I digested. So I think that's dangerous, obviously, and they also include things like talking about their grandchildren. There's a place where they use their grandchildren as an example, and they list 3 of them and talks about them crying. She says, like, by 4 weeks, it took granddaughter 5 minutes of crying to nap. So those kind of things normalize parents letting a 4-week-old cry it out, which I think any sleep training, whatever you think about sleep training these days, I don't think any resources saying do this with 4-week-olds, with 6-week-olds, something like that. So there's this, I think, particularly for parents who have no other concept, or, I mean, imagine this, you're at a church where all these people are all in on it, and the parents are glowing. They're saying, we get sleep. We're getting full nights of sleep from day 1, day 14. And they also talk about how a baby shouldn't interrupt your life. They kind of say, yes, there'll be a little disruption when you first welcome a baby home, but it really shouldn't interrupt your life. That's child-centered. So this is this is a piece of it too. So I think it probably was appealing to people. There weren't many safeguards. They give the exception. They kind of say there are 2 reasons this might not work for you. And that would be colic or GERD, G-E-R-D, the reflux. But they basically say colic is not as common as people think. That's a direct quote. And then for their advice for GERD is basically do on demand what you need to do, but work towards progress toward this goal. It just might take longer. So I thought that was interesting that was kind of their, well, these people can feed on demand. It's okay here. No one else can.
Right.
So not a lot of safeguards here. And so I'm not sure what a parent, inexperienced parent or a parent who's all in on this would do if it didn't work. Or, I mean, they're not able to respond to their baby's cues. Like, these people are telling them to do that, but there's so much mixed messaging.
Well, right. And if you're promised that if you do this right, your baby will sleep through the night by 8 weeks.
Yeah.
Then they're basically telling you anything after that is not a cue. It's just manipulation, Yes. So I am kind of floored by that advice, like a 2-month-old baby sleeping through the night. I'm like, I know people who have had babies who do sleep through the night at, a couple months old, but I know many who have not.
None of my kids did.
And I think when they self-report those numbers, if those are numbers coming from parents in their own community, you can't trust those numbers.
Right.
And there's so much pressure to be doing it right. And I think as a new parent, if you feel like there's something your baby should be doing, there can be so much shame. Like, is your baby rolling over yet? Why isn't there's like a million things. There's so many things that you're kind of like prepped to feel shame for if your baby isn't doing yet. And that self-reported number is wild to me, but also, I mean, it is surely not accurate.
Right.
But
I mean, who even knows? Well, and this becomes a problem later with critiques, and we can maybe move there shortly, but their citations are a train wreck. Like, they cite, like, people were mad. They cite Dr. Sears as a, like, support of their method. They cited several people where they just cherry picked things, so it made it seem like, and those people later objected and said, I would never
put my name on this. Yeah.
So they do that. They have a number of like self-reported internal studies, and then they do weird things. Like, this is the one I referenced earlier. They have this part where they're talking about, this is a direct quote. This is kind of like the kind of fears that show up. Research demonstrates that immediate gratification negatively impacts ability to learn. And then they list some other things it impacts. These are all prerequisites for academic advancement. So they're talking about that in the midst of you don't want to feed on demand babies. And they have a little citation. But when you go to the citation, they're citing that famous time study on the emotional intelligence, the marshmallow experiment, where kindergartners are sat in a room, and if they're given the chance to eat the marshmallow, or if they wait, they'll get more marshmallows, and then they followed up down the road. So it's just a weird way of trying to support their claims that doesn't track. But if you're reading along, you're like, oh, yes, academic advancement is based on my infant's ability to be on this schedule.
Yes.
And there's really no basis for that.
Oh my goodness.
And then there's a lot of things that they just present, like the one like that an example of that would be them saying, well, colic is less common than is reported. There's no citation. So they have a lot of medical common sensey claims. We talk about that, how a lot of these resources just present things as common sense. They do it with medical advice in really troubling ways, which is interesting because that is their claim to authority in this book, that this is medically sound advice for parents.
Right. And they wrote it with a doctor, right? They wrote it with a doctor.
Yeah. A doctor who was not very experienced and later had to go. He was, I don't know what the word for it is in the medical community, the equivalent of like being reprimanded. He failed to diagnose a very serious case of infant GERD in his practice, and those parents later filed a complaint, and he like had to take some additional training, something like this. So it's interesting to think of the way this maybe played out for people. Would they even go to a doctor in time? Would they know? I don't know. Would they know? They do in their book try and say you need to be monitoring your baby's growth. So again, I want to throw them that bone. They have a chapter where they say you should be weighing them or making sure they're gaining weight. But it's not very precise, really, what they say. They also have a chapter about different feeding. They're very clearly pro breastfeeding and against formula feeding. So they kind of like, that's the best way to go. So they do try and make some nuances there of like, maybe it's a little bit different for breastfed versus formula fed babies. I don't know if that does enough to counterbalance these promises of 8 weeks sleep through the night in the way it needs to, really. I don't know. But to be honest, like they do have some of those things throughout the book. But what do you know? Once this book gained popularity, pediatricians began speaking out against it.
They're like, you're following what advice now?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's
talk about the controversy.
Let's now talk about the controversy, because I feel like we have a picture here. Let's kind of like recap. This is a lot about sleep training. This is a lot about getting a schedule. This is a lot about doing those things and asserting your parental authority, but not with face language, just with like, this will make your child a higher achiever and it will help them develop the ability to deal with delayed gratification,
and they'll be more
secure.
They'll be more conscious of others. They won't be self-absorbed. Like there's all these kinds of general claims to like, your kid will be a better kid.
Yes. Okay. So pediatricians start to realize, hey, where are people getting this very, very extreme advice?
Yes. And they start, so in the 1990s, they begin speaking out against them. And this, I think, is 93, I think is when Babywise was published. So, and it does very well. I mean, on the copy I have from like the early 2000s, it's over 2 million sold. I mean, millions of books were sold.
Wow.
So pediatricians begin speaking out. A doctor named Matthew Aney collected 300 examples that pediatricians had documented of failure to thrive in families following this. And they began writing about their concerns, looking at the footnotes, as I mentioned, kind of like saying this is not, because in Babywise, they do make some claims of like, look at what the AAP, the American Association of Pediatricians, says in support of our work. So then you have all these pediatricians pushing back on that and people saying no. Gary claimed that he had an advisory board of medical expertise, but he never disclosed, to my knowledge, I couldn't find where he disclosed any of that publicly. So he kind of claimed that his publisher, Multnomah, never had medical professionals advising. So they really were making all these claims based on the doctor who co-wrote, who knows? He wrote the preface. His name's a co-author, but who knows? And I think, not to be discounted, Anne Marie was a nurse, so I think that probably lent them some credibility. So it's unclear. It was a problem. It led to concerns in the broader community. And then around that time, people started raising theological concerns and psychological concerns as well. So in the 90s, as it gained popularity, it did gain pushback. This is one of the few resources where I think we see some collective accountability for some of the experts. Okay. You have pastors who are reading it and advising their congregations not to follow it. Or as people said, we want to start this coaching seminary thing in our church because that's kind of how it spread. Leaders were saying, no, we don't think this is good. Psychologists and counselors were reading Growing Kids God's Way in particular and saying, this is not good for child development, this very authoritarian kind of parent, because that really could sum up, if I had to sum it all up, it's that parents as gods yet again, but really in this all very thorough, very scrupulous way. And so lots of people kind of speaking out against it. And then I think this is really what brought accountability is in the mid-90s, Grace Church did not like Gary's divisiveness and authoritarian leadership style, which is what he had been asked to leave the previous church for. And in 1997, MacArthur denounced him and said he was unfit for leadership.
Wow.
And I think that probably is the reason, perhaps, other pastors kind of like reached critical mass, right? Like all of these people saying there are problems. And it seems like a similar pattern happened. When this would happen at a smaller church or even at Grace, people would leave over it. It would divide the church because there was such loyalty. It reminds me a little bit of what we see with like Doug Wilson or any of these guys who verge on cult-like thinking. You are either a good person who likes the leader or you're an enemy out to get them. You are destroying their career. You're vicious, you are on the outside. So so that's what happened when they left Grace. Some other families went with them. It sounds like they started another church, and Gary was there for a while until he was excommunicated from that church as well.
Wow.
So,
okay.
Yeah, you see a pattern.
So connecting the dots here, this has to do with like him personally, his leadership style, his communication style. That's kind of what ends up getting him in trouble.
I think that's what ends up really getting him in trouble. But also people are raising concerns with the content of his teaching. But I think that's what gets him booted out of places, which is, it tracks, right? Like we talk about this a lot, how the people who write these books are kind of parenting their readers in the on trend with their parenting style, right? Like L.R. Nost, who we talked about last week, when she writes her book, there's more asking questions or inviting readers to engage. And here's Gary saying parent-directed authority all the way, no question, establish authority. And so it's not too surprising that he is uncontested authority, believes himself to be, right? And so maybe you rub up against other people who find themselves to be authority figures, like a John MacArthur or something. It's going to be fireworks, I would think.
Yeah. So, okay, that's so, I have so many questions about that, but it does sound like some of the details of it are probably, we would just be speculating. So
and there's, for anyone interested, I'll throw it in there. There's a whole Watchdog website that has a timeline and documentation. And MacArthur, you can read the statement he put out. Like he issued a public statement. All the churches issued public statements. Now, whether the Ezzos would say that was fair or not, who knows? But these are all out there. Ultimately, it led to Multnomah there was kind of a back and forth. They were going to pull the book, and then they didn't pull the book, and then they did pull the book. An editor at Multnomah recommended that the book be pulled. He wasn't, as the Ezzo's editor, he came after the book came. Looks like the publisher intervened and said, we're not pulling the book, but then that editor resigned, and they ultimately ended up pulling the book. And Gary went on to essentially self-publish. Someone from Multnomah who worked at Multnomah helped him self-publish. And it's still that the Babywise brand went pretty far under that and still continues to do well. The Ezzos ended up moving to the Southeast once they got excommunicated from the last church, and focused on foreign markets, international markets. They really focused on that through streaming parenting classes. They were estranged from all their adult children at one point. It's unclear what happened with that.
Oh my goodness.
But the third excommunication happened because his son-in-law was accused of misappropriating funds from the ministry, the Growing Kids God's Way ministry. And so there were family lawsuits, and he threatened to like send his daughter and son-in-law to jail. I mean, it's just the drama of I think the ideology playing out in the communities they lived in. Wow. You kind of see like the confronting the authority. And then they're still around. I don't know if they talk much about parenting anymore. Anne-Marie blogged for a while, but they kind of turned over the international streaming site. There's another couple like in charge of it. So I don't know if they kind of turned it over to somebody else. But yeah, that is kind of the implosion of the empire. But I'm sure it made millions of dollars and impacted millions of families before it imploded.
And that pivot to international is something we've seen before.
Yep.
Reb Bradley did this, yes. Who wrote the book, what's the title of his book again?
Is it Hints on Child Training? Something like that.
No, Reb Bradley is the one. Is it Hints on Child Training? No, that's an older one. I don't remember what the name of his book, but it was a pro-corporal punishment one.
For sure, yeah.
Withhold not correction, right?
That's Bruce Ray.
I get them confused at this point.
We write about him in our book because we had a chance to interview him.
Yeah.
So,
but some of these people, when their teaching falls out of favor among American Christians, they go to international markets where the name doesn't have recognition, but they bring with them this kind of imported authority, which is icky in all kinds of ways.
So many layers of exploitation and grossness. And we sometimes hear from Christians who live in other countries who will say, look, Ted Tripp's still really popular here. He's like the top of the church. So I do think there's also just kind of that missionary legacy of like maybe 5 to 10 years, but like offset the timeline. So I think finding new markets, it's gross. For sure. And that happened to some extent here and maybe still is. I don't really have a clear sense of how wide reaching that is. Like, it would be interesting to know, well, how many streaming classes do they have? Is there like 5 around the world, or is it like 100? I'm not exactly sure how many people are still, but I mean, the Babywise books are still recommended. The secular version, I think Growing Kids God's Way, less so, because it lost its pipeline. It lost the endorsement of someone like John MacArthur. There's a paper trail of Christian leaders expressing concerns. There's less churches willing to affiliate, I think. But the secular version still finds impact in like the sleep training camp. Yeah.
You do see, I don't see as much like explicitly Christian sleep training, baby training stuff these days.
Yeah.
I do see some in influencer content every once in a while, but it's pretty, I'd say it's pretty coded or pretty vague. Like I will see, I don't know if you see posts like this, but definitely the emphasis on your kids need to see that your spouse is your number one priority. Yes. I see that all the time in influencer content. I also see the whole don't let your children run the show kind of thing. That takes a lot of different forms. And I know that idea existed before the Ezzos, but I do think that they probably were the first to really market that idea as your way of exercising parental authority, not just in discipline, but in dictating the rhythms of your family life. It makes me think of that one viral post, Joe Webbin. He's a he's a Christian influencer at this point. Yeah. And
provocateur, I think.
something about I'm going to get this quote wrong, but it was we don't remember how many kids he has. There are 4 people I dictate when they eat and when do they go to the bathroom or something like that. This all-encompassing authority.
And they're my kids. And he's saying it without any qualification.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was distinct. I mean, I printed off because even Dobson expressed concern. So I'm going to read them because I thought it was interesting. This is
Yeah.
his question. He says, I am familiar with it, and we get asked that question so often that we have a statement that we'd be glad to provide for you that will
Wow.
tell you what our concerns are about it. I've never
Wow.
attacked it, but I don't endorse it. I don't feel real good about it. To start with, I'm concerned with the title of the program, which implies that there's only one way to deal with all the myriad of circumstances that come up in the realm of child rearing. You know, there's interpretation of God's way. Otherwise, we'd all see everything exactly the same, and we don't. So it's a little dogmatic in that regard. For Dobson to say it's dogmatic, he's on to say. And secondly, there is a rigidity to it that worries me about young children. Children differ tremendously in temperament, as you know. They come into the world differently, and some of them are easy to raise, and some of them are tougher than nails. And you try to take one of those ADD kids or one of those very aggressive youngsters and try to put them in a box like they recommend, and I think you can create some problems. So I'm not out here campaigning against the Ezzos. I'm just not their greatest fan.
Wow.
So I thought that was a very
Interesting.
interesting.
You know, I think this is an example of something that we didn't write about a lot because it feels overly speculative to me. But sometimes when I read a statement like that, in contrast to what Dobson says, I think a lot of the parenting advice that Christian parents end up with is sort of like this version of someone saying, I trust my own judgment. Like Dobson
Yes.
here is saying, like, I
know
trust,
when it's too far, it's too far.
right, because in Dare to Discipline, he talks about, starting spanking kids at like 15 to 18 months, right?
Yeah.
And sort of saying like, but, use discernment, don't spank for everything. Like
Right.
he's sort of, he trusts that he can kind of discern when it's appropriate and wants parents to be discerning about it. And then he encounters someone else who's saying something authoritarian also and harsh. It doesn't necessarily trust that they have
So I don't mean that, but
right. And I feel like that kind of thing happens a lot. I think a lot of these teachers are kind of saying, I trust me and my discernment.
Right.
And the minute they see someone else saying, trust me and my discernment, they're like, no.
Yeah.
not that.
Well, and I wonder too if it's like a dynamic of speaking in generalizations to a lot of people, all these guys, to thousands of people, where it's kind of like megachurch, where you lose the pastoral connection because they really are in some ways operating in a pastoral way as well. And so I don't know, again, it is really speculative, but I could see a place where experts or influencers are really like, yes, my advice is measured. It will never be used negatively. My intention is to help. And so the idea that it could go horribly wrong, or the idea that a young couple could apply it literally in a way that could be harmful, maybe would be horrifying for them, or maybe they would say, well, they did it wrong. But yeah, it really is. It's an interesting evaluation, because I think there are plenty of people out here who would think of Dobson's advice as very similar to the Ezzos, or perhaps they would say, Dobson's is extraordinarily authoritarian and harmful, and the Ezzos is just that much more authoritarian and harmful. Perhaps, I'm not sure. But yeah, I thought that was really interesting.
That's fascinating.
And I agree with you that it kind of became like, just this week, even on social media, the parenting conversation on Christian Twitter, one was about, some, she's not a parenting expert, but she's a self-platformed Bible teacher, kind of telling Christian parents they need to get it together in the grocery store. Like, their crying toddler, it's unpleasant for other people to be around, so they need to pull that together. And another conversation was around cry it out expectations. So I think these are kind of perpetual touch points that capture the sentiment you're describing, where, yeah, parents should have authority. There's a lot of pressure on them to get it right. And there's a lot of large feelings around sleep training conversations, because there's that implicit critique too. Like, if cry it out isn't okay, and I've used cry it out, then the idea that there might be another way is saying, I made my baby cry unnecessarily, right? Like
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
touches some fragile places.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Those are some of my least favorite online exchanges or arguments
Yeah.
about stuff like that, because they are so personal. People really get up in arms about
Yeah.
decisions about cry it out or not. And it's one of those things that I think people want. I think when I think about the need or the really deep desire that this book probably met, people want
Mm-hmm.
a reason. They want a reason why something is right, and they want to do it. Like they
Yes.
want a method that is the right one, and they want to do it, and they want it to come with a kind of sense of righteousness, and
Yeah.
this Babywise offered that to people, and it's saying that you are right to want sleep and to insist that your baby let you sleep, and here
Yep.
is why this is a righteous cause for you, and that's such an enticing message.
It is. And you're so, I mean, I remember, do you remember? You're so exhausted. You're so exhausted. You're so sleep deprived. And I have a distinct memory of, like, I didn't have streaming or social media conversations to make me feel bad as a parent. Thank the Lord. I don't know how people navigate that. But I remember sitting in the back corner of Barnes and Noble by the parenting section, just skimming all the sleep books. Probably, like, you hit those leaps, or what, we didn't have that language back then either, but it was probably like 6 months in and some leap, and I was like, how
What am I doing wrong?
what am I doing wrong? Like,
Yeah.
where's the elusive trick that will make this work so I
Yes.
can get sleep?
Yes.
And it's just tough. It's just a really hard stage. So I think it's really understandable and sounds pretty dreamy if someone's like, you don't have to do that, and in fact helps you feel like you're serving your child better.
Right.
That's what the Ezzos do. Like, it's really in your child's best interest that you have them sleeping through the night at 8 weeks.
Yes.
I
Yep.
I was looking because I wanted to provide, do you have that plow quote we were talking about earlier this week? Access to it?
Let me look at it real quick.
I thought
Let
that
me see
might
if I
be a
can find
nice
it.
place to land, because it's
Yeah.
such a contrast from this parent directed, whether it's the Ezzo's kind of like hyper controlling, and as we'll see, Growing Kids God's Way is simply this level of parental control and structure through every stage of a child's life with a lot of doctrinal weight. That is essentially what that book is. So that kind of extraordinary version of, not only is there a way you have to get it right, but that way is going to mean the parent has got to direct everything.
Yes.
Which so many families just were smothered under the pressure of. But you sent a little clip from, do you have it?
Yes, I do. So this week there was an article in Plow, which is a magazine. We can put it in the show notes. The title of it is Parenting Like God, but it is an excerpt from a writing of from a minister, Victoria. Let me find the name here. By Norman MacLeod. Writing in the mid 19th century, 1856, and the book he was writing was called The Home School. And we talk about how, like, parenting advice, Christian parenting advice, has shifted over time, and how these biblical ideas that we have now are really 20th century ideas. And that is so clear when you read these Victorian writers talking about children, because they had very different ideas about children. And this is something that he wrote in 1856. I have no advice whatever to offer parents as to home education during infancy beyond this: to interfere with their children as little as possible. There are few things in this world more wonderful to a thoughtful mind, or more delightful to a benevolent heart, than the joy of children. They are planning, contriving, and enjoying all day long. With all this, God has placed them in his own school of providence. And in 10,000 ways, too many to number and too deep to understand, he is educating them and teaching them lessons innumerable. He is doing so chiefly through what you yourselves are, and by the constant influence which is unconsciously exercised in the household by your own personal character. So when I sent you this, I said, this is like the anti-shepherding a child's heart advice. Leave your kids alone. They're just learning by watching not what you're saying, but what you are. I mean, this is
and
the
they're
extreme
lovely
opposite.
as they are,
And they're
right?
lovely
Like it's kind
as
of what
they
they're
are.
saying. They're great. Isn't that wonderful? They're busy about good things, as opposed to this idea that idle hands are the devil works. You know, like they're busy about leave them alone and they will turn out bad. The idea here being like, it's the opposite.
Which the Victorians very much saw children as innocents, to be protected from the outside world. And the idea was you want to keep them uncorrupted from the outside as young as possible. There was a deep fear of the loss of innocence. Whereas a lot of the parenting advice I think we're still processing through, it comes from very reformed tradition, which is your children are corrupt and sinners from the beginning. You are managing their sin nature and teaching them to manage their outside world. And keeping them from the outside world. But this is such a different orientation. And it still puts a burden on the parents. It's sort of saying like, well, if you aren't a good person, your kids aren't going to be good people. It's very like children will absorb by osmosis what their parent is.
And I love what you, in our book, Chelsea wrote a chapter on children as human beings, and I won't give too many spoilers, but I love how you kind of point out that whether it's the angel personification of a child or the angel of innocence or kind of the like viper in a diaper, both rob children of their humanity. And that shows up in resources, even if it sounds a little bit more appealing.
Yes. Right. Well, we're reading this not because we think it's like, oh, this is the perfect parenting advice. We've had a lot. There are problems with this.
Yeah, I think it's just an interesting marker of like other times where Christians are looking at children and parenting through an entirely different lens.
Yes. And the writer of this would have said this is biblical, what they're offering here. But for a lot of parents today, this would read as absolutely not, as this permissive parenting that isn't taking home discipleship seriously enough. I think we're seeing a real resurgence of like home discipleship as being really important, and this is kind of like the opposite of that. Don't do that. So
for sure. Well, and what would you say? I mean, I think there's so much more we could talk about here. We'll move on to Growing Kids God's Way next time.
Yes.
I think probably most of the people listening and joining us in the church library for books like these are adult. Well, I don't know, but I hear from a lot of adult children wanting to know about Growing Kids God's Way. I don't know if I've heard from any parents who implemented it that they wanted to hear more. But I'm wondering how it lands. I don't know. Like I had one good friend who I know used it. From the early weeks. I remember her talking about her baby sleeping through it like 4 weeks.
Wow.
And went on to have other children and just deeply regretted using it with her first, as she grew in experience and understood more about baby development and was able to recognize that there were losses in attachment that you don't get back, right? That's what's so destructive about the Babywise version of the infant version of this, right? Because these are such key developmental periods and so formative in parental child attachment. There's just a lot to grieve, I think, there, because man, we've both been parents. It's such a vulnerable time. And I feel like, especially those early months, I'm just so sad for all the families who got sucked into this. I think it's that difficult line between being victimizers and being victims, but it makes me so sad to think of 70 million or what, no, 70,000, not 70 million, whatever it was, 70,000, but several million families buying into this and parents not having those moments of attachment with their infants. And, so if you are listening back and reflecting back, we're lamenting maybe alongside you because there's a lot of loss here.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of loss and just at the hands of people who sort of just decided they were going to give all this advice, and that
that seems like an unbearable weight.
Yeah, that's just hard to process. So those of you who are processing that advice or other similar advice, we are sad with you.
Yeah. And when we chose our subtitle, I have this in mind a lot of the time when I'm thinking about betrayed entire families, because certainly children bore the brunt of a lot of these family life teachings, but it betrayed entire families because parents trusted. They trusted all the doctors that recommended this book. They trusted the doctor that co-wrote it. They trusted the Ezzos who positioned themselves, right? And it was misplaced trust. And that's a lot.
Yeah. Goodness.
This is a downer of a way to
end the episode. I'm trying to think of a way to bring it back up, but I also don't want to brush that off.
Yeah, so we don't need to silver lining.
No, we can just wrap it up and say, and say we'll continue talking about the Ezzos next week with Growing Kids God's Way.
Yeah, we might have an interview in between the two episodes. I'm not exactly sure who we have. We have a couple of great interviews coming up. We're excited about that.
Yes. And but there's just a lot to say about the Ezzos, and so we'll continue.
Yeah, we'll continue the conversation. Thanks as always, Kelsey. It's always great to get good conversation with you. I hope your conference as well.
Thank you. I will be here in Atlanta for a couple days and then back to Iowa. So thanks for chatting, and thanks for being with us, everyone. We'll see you next time in the library.
We are so glad you've joined us in the church library today. This is Marissa Franksbert
and Kelsey Kramer McGinnis. And if you liked what you heard here, we think you'll be interested in reading our forthcoming book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting: How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families.
You can pre-order it now wherever books are sold, and it'll be on shelves in October of 2025.